Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on Israeli intelligence and the campaign against Iran. My name is Natalie Kost and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Intelligence Analysis playlist. During this program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Welcome to Inside Intelligence, everyone. Today, our guest is Itai Shapira. He served for more than 25 years in the Israeli Defense Intelligence in strategic, operational, and tactical levels, retiring as a colonel. He holds a BA in Economics and Philosophy and an MBA from Tel Aviv University and is a graduate of the Israeli National Defense College. He earned his PhD from the University of Leicester, studying Israeli national intelligence culture. He's a frequent contributor to Intelligence and National Security and other important journals. And his book, Israeli National Intelligence Culture, Problem Solving, Exceptionalism, and Pragmatism, was published by Routledge in 2024. And we're proud to say that Itai Shapira is a member of our faculty here at the Masters of Science and Intelligence Analysis. Itai, welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you again. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm going to call you Itai for this program, okay? So people won't be shocked by me if I call you Shapira. People think Americans will think that's rude. Well, today we're here to talk about the Israeli intelligence successes against Iran. Let's start out with that. What can you give us in terms of an overview and maybe a little background on how this got started and where do you see the future going?
Yes, thank you. I think for Israeli intelligence, and by the way, for Israeli security and defense intelligence more broadly, the campaign against Iran, which started on June 12th, on the one hand, it reflects, I think, many lessons learned from the colossal policy, defense, and intelligence failure of October 7th, 2023. With the Hamas surprise attack against Israel. Many lessons have been learned in terms of a more proactive, a more preventive approach. This issue of lesson learning from October 7th is explicitly mentioned by the IDF, for example, Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, and by the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Minister of Defense. Mainly, I think the issue of preventing existential threats before they materialize and taking action. So on the one hand, I think these are lessons learned, and with Israel recognizing or identifying a dramatic change in its strategic and operational environment, starting with the major blows to Hezbollah in Lebanon in September 2024, then the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria and many other cases. But on the other hand, I see the campaign against Iran as reflecting many traditional cultural facets, both of Israeli defense establishments and also its intelligence establishments. First and foremost, this concept of preventing adversaries from acquiring or developing nuclear weapons, also known as the Begin Doctrine, named after the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin for the first strike against the Iraqi reactor in 1981. This issue of preventive action against adversary nuclear projects is a traditional one. The second issue is that Israel, once it defines a threat as existential, which was the case with the Iranian nuclear program, and has also become the case with the Iranian ballistic missile program, as also the case with the Iranian program to destroy Israel or plan to destroy Israel. Once Israel defines a threat as existential, it takes action. So again, on the one hand, lesson learning from October 7th, recognizing that many mistakes have been made and that action must be taken. But on the other hand, I think many traditional cultural facets, Israeli strategic culture and intelligence culture. And when I look more specifically, Michael, regarding Israeli intelligence, I think, first of all, when we teach intelligence or when we discuss intelligence, almost every aspect of intelligence can be found in the role of Israeli intelligence in the campaign against Iran. Of course, different products of intelligence. The first one regarding knowledge, because Israeli intelligence definitely informed strategic decision-making, military campaigning, targeting, but also operations conducted by intelligence agencies. In the case of Iran, specifically the Mossad covert operations. All levels of intelligence, I think, can be present here, are very evident here. Israeli intelligence, I think, had dramatic tactical and targeting intelligence successes, enabling Israel to strike the Iranian nuclear sites and to assassinate Iranian military leadership and to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists, and also enabled Israel to defend itself from the Iranian missiles. I think Israeli intelligence had major achievements in operational level intelligence. In Hebrew, by the way, the word for operational level and systemic is the same word, but in English. But I think Israeli intelligence had successes in both these aspects, recognizing what were really the critical vulnerabilities or the bottlenecks of the Iranian establishments, which should be targeted. The issue of strategic intelligence, Michael, I think this is still to be learned. We still don't know what were the strategic assessment of Israeli intelligence, IDI, military intelligence, and Mossad, regarding the state of the Iranian nuclear program or ballistic program. We know what the Israeli Prime Minister says and the Minister of Defense, but naturally we still don't have the authentic intelligence assessments. But I think in terms of Israeli intelligence, this is somewhat, I think, in some aspects, and I assume we will discuss these later, at least in the aspects of operational level, of targeting intelligence, some sort of, I think, of reflecting a resilient establishment, which was able to recover from this colossal failure of October 7th, absorb, recover, adapt, and in some cases even thrive. So I think, this is just to begin with, this is the context. And I think one of the most interesting issues, which we'll probably discuss later, is what is now the relationship? What is the interaction between Israeli intelligence and Israeli decision makers? This is a very, very tough issue here in Israel, in Israeli public discourse. By the way, it's becoming political discourse. And there are also many lessons for this. But I think Israeli intelligence, at least in the campaign against Iran, the context was recognizing a strategic opportunity since the strategic and operation environment has changed, creating the intelligence which enables both to make the decision to strike Iran, an unprecedented decision, but also to execute that decision through operational level and tactical level intelligence. And I hope, and with that I would end, I hope Israeli intelligence is still maintaining or staying humble, not becoming arrogant, not once again exercising hubris, because I think personally that hubris and arrogance and even complacency was one of the factors for the October 7th colossal failure.
Let's talk a little bit about one of what seemed to be one of the most ostentatious successes against Iran, which was that of having a strong human intelligence network established, which seemed to be, at least from what I read, what was lacking in the Gaza case. Can you speak a little bit more to that? It must have taken many years to develop such a network.
I think, first of all, I think you're totally right. I think it probably did take many years to develop such a network, which of course relies on advanced technology. This is not the human of the 1960s or 1970s. It's present day human. And I think, first of all, in Gaza in October 2023, definitely human was missing. I think there was an over-reliance on technology, combined with the issue that the specific scenario of a Hamas mass invasion to conquer portions of Israeli territory on the way to destroy Israel was then, unfortunately, inconceivable. I think the case of Iran, by the way, in some aspects, also the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon during 2024, was a case of when you have much time to prepare, then I think you can establish human networks. And I think, again, in Israel, like in Israel, many things are not published. But what seems to me is that, again, in Iran, it was a human network establishing presence, stand in Iran, allowing, excuse me, and enabling the use of advanced technologies. And I think one of the lessons Israeli intelligence has learned from October 7th is that reliance on technology is necessary, but over-reliance on technology might be dangerous. And I've written a little bit about this, about Israeli intelligence culture, about Israeli strategic culture. I think Israeli writ large tend to do what I called over-adaptation. They move between the extreme ends. Either you're very traditional and conservative, and in terms of intelligence collection, traditional human and so forth, or you're exceptionally innovative with advanced technologies and so forth. It seems to me like in this campaign against Iran, and as you mentioned, in the many years where Israeli intelligence and Israeli defense intelligence had the time to establish this infrastructure, it seems to me like in this case, it was more balanced in terms of different collection disciplines, more balanced, I think, at least between tactical level intelligence and operational level intelligence. And again, I hope that it was also more balanced in terms of remaining humble and understanding the limitations, although the campaign on the operational level was very successful.
One thing I wonder about, and Israel has a lot of priorities from the intelligence point of view. And was some of this just a matter of simply having to spread resources thinly, to various different threats? I mean, when we've been looking at this situation, and there's been some remarkable stories. For example, we got it. Apparently, it was in the press that we had intelligence on the Houthis from Israel, and we know, of course, about Lebanon. Then there's the Iran going on. I mean, how these aren't huge services. How much could we? I can imagine if somebody had said, "Look, we don't need to spend so much time on the ground in Gaza. We've got other priorities right now, and we've got that pretty much. We feel like we've got a pretty good handle on that." Is that a possible hypothesis? Looking at this,
I think it is a very possible and plausible hypothesis. Let me just illustrate this. When the head of the IDI's Research and Analysis Division, Amit Sar, Brigadier General Amit Sar, was interviewed after October 7th, he still is very ill. He became very ill. Very sad story. And the interviewer asked him, because several weeks and months prior to October 7th, Amit, the head of the Research and Analysis Division, but also other senior officers, sent letters to the Israeli Prime Minister during 2023, recognizing that Israeli deterrence was eroding and that Israel's adversary might take advantage of, the Israeli domestic turmoil. But Amit confessed, and others also confessed. He said, "But I did not think about Hamas. I thought about Iran and about Hezbollah." And I have maybe two issues to say, again, just possible hypotheses. First of all, I think it's an interesting situation of some sort of vicious circle. Your intelligence priorities naturally influence your intelligence analysis insights, which in their turn influence the intelligence priorities. And I think in October 7th, definitely most of the resources were dedicated to, of course, the Iranian issue, the nuclear, the ballistic missiles, the PGMs, precision-guided missiles, to Hezbollah. And although the IDF in 2019, the IDF then formed what it called the theory of victory. By the way, an American style term, a theory of victory to defeat what the IDF then called terror militaries, Hamas and Hezbollah. But even regarding Hamas and Hezbollah, that theory of victory, an operational level theory of victory, which was also accompanied by a force design plan, a multi-force design plan, it should have engaged Hamas and Hezbollah, but it was the actual resources were more dedicated to Hezbollah. So I think your hypothesis is very possible, because we know that in October 7th, it's not only, I think it was a tragic convergence of two issues. First of all, regarding the prioritization or the threat perception, the Israeli threat perception at the time was focused on Iran and on Hezbollah. Iran and its proxies in Iraq and in Syria, and on Hezbollah. And I think the tragic convergence was with arrogance and hubris regarding Gaza Strip, where Israeli defense establishments, but also Israeli intelligence establishments, felt or assessed that they know what's going on in Gaza. It's a tragic convergence between low priority and high confidence. And I think with Lebanon and Iran, since these were high priorities for many, many years, I think you can see even, a general conclusion. This is a difference between being surprised and surprising the adversary. Hezbollah was completely surprised on September 2024. Nasrallah, I think, did not believe that the Israelis would strike him in his underground bunker in Beirut. And we know that the Iranians were surprised by the Israeli attack. So I think your hypothesis is very plausible in terms of the interaction between intelligence analysis, intelligence priorities, and when you do not dedicate enough resources, and you think that these minor resources are enough, I think this convergence is one of the factors for the October 2023 tragedy.
Right. And it's a contained threat, even at the worst case, right? Worst case scenario wasn't really perceived, whatever, right? Anyway, okay, so off that topic, but back to now, right? So after significant intelligence victories, what's next? We can't imagine that the intelligence, the human networks, even the technical collection capability would be as strong now after the adversaries have been alerted. What is the thinking now, or are we able to say some things about that? How to rebuild?
Yes, I think in terms of intelligence on the strategic level, and again, unfortunately, this discussion has become politicized. But on the strategic level, I think the two major questions is what really happened to the Iranian nuclear program, what really happened to the Iranian ballistic missile program. But I would add a third question, which is again puzzling for me. What will happen to this model of what the Americans call the Iranian threat network, to this model of proxy network? I think on the operational level, again, I have no answer, but I think that Israeli intelligence is troubled by this question because on the one hand, you can say, okay, there were some, setbacks, but this is a whole concept. The Iranian proxy network is a concept at the operational level, which enables the execution of a strategy to export the revolution. But on the other hand, let's look what happened to this proxy model. Hezbollah is no longer the Hezbollah we knew. Look, Israel and the US struck Iranian nuclear program. Hezbollah didn't fire one rocket towards Israel. Amazing. There is no Assad regime in Syria. The militias in Iraq are rather deterred. One of the architects of this proxy model, Qasem Soleimani, was assassinated by the US in 2020. So, I remember the scene from Monty Python movie. What's left of this proxy model network when all of its components are missing? I always give much credit to the Iranians. This is my nature as an Israeli intelligence officer. I always give the Iranians credit. I think they will think of a new model. My personal assessment, it will not be the same decentralized model with the IRGC in Iran and then, in Iraq and in Yemen and Hezbollah. But I think this is, so we have strategic level questions, we have operational level questions. And I think one of the major challenges for Israeli intelligence now will be to execute what Israeli politicians have declared as a new Israeli policy. It sounds weird, but of compellence in Iran. we as Israelis, we naturally think of compellence, of course, in Gaza against Hamas, compellence now against Hezbollah and Lebanon from rebuilding itself, but compellence against Iran, that's a different story. And I think that for now, for Israeli intelligence, there's a major challenge now to monitor where they reach uranium and the Iranian military industries. And where are the Chinese and the Russians? Where have they disappeared? Are they going to rebuild the, excuse me, the Iranian air defense? So I think now, once again, Israeli intelligence has so many levels of challenges at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. And I just want to mention that when I said compellence, I meant that this is a method known in the grand theory as one part of coercion. Compellence meaning actively causing your adversary to change course, not through deterrence, but through operations. This is what Israel has been doing in Lebanon for the last 5 months. So I think dramatic challenges, and once again, challenges between intelligence and decision-making. Israeli politicians have taken a stand. Israeli defense establishments, I think, since October 7th, are in a very, very delicate situation. Very delicate.
Let's talk a little bit about, and by the way, folks, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function, or you could use the chat as well. I monitor both of them. And we're enjoying this conversation with Itai Shapira very much. There's one thing we like to get back to now, and this is your topic, right, is the intelligence culture. And so where we saw this at work, and you've mentioned it a little bit already, and how the culture adapted and was able to perform very well against the Iran threat. But there again, we saw some blind spots with dealing with Hamas. So what, I mean, has this rounded out your view of how you see intelligence culture? Has this changed some of your perspectives on it?
First of all, it has. You know, I wrote the book prior to October 7th. I updated it a little bit, but it has. And I don't want to get too much into the philosophy of cultural studies, but we know that culture, specifically strategic cultures and intelligence cultures, are not unitary in essence, nor are they fixed in time. It's a constant struggle between, or competition for dominance between subcultures, and culture is always changing. Although, you know, realists would claim against cultural studies, it's true. You cannot see culture. You cannot feel it. It's not tangible. But as the late, great Colin Gray referred to culture, I think it's a context. So I think both these issues, October 7th and the campaign against Iran, did round my perception of Israeli intelligence culture. For example, I think prior to October 7th, what I found out is a term, again, I adopted from one of my mentors, Professor Jeannie Johnson, which studies strategic culture. I think that prior to October 7th and this colossal failure, what I found out is that was a gap between the aspirational norms of Israeli intelligence and its realized behavior. Its aspirational norms, as I've written and as I've discussed, and as all of my interviewees, because, you know, Michael, I interviewed like 34 people for the first book. Israeli aspiration norms of intelligence professionalism are contrarian thinking, moral courage. Israelis, by the way, this is how I was raised. Israeli analysis despise the word consensus. Despise the word consensus. It's all about disagreements and arguments and shouting. By the way, it also has even some Jewish roots. And tragically enough, fortunately, on October 7th, this was missing in the realized behavior. There was much groupthink prior to October 7th. Not just between agencies, IDI, you know, the military intelligence, and Shabak, Shin Bet, but also inside the IDI, inside the ADF. The intelligence officer of the Gaza division, the intelligence officer of the Southern Command, and the intelligence at the general staff all held the same assessment about Hamas. This is groupthink. And another gap I found that it did round my perception of Israeli is the gap between aspiration norms and realized behavior. Again, unfortunately, because Israelis pride themselves, or used to pride themselves, on a very good and deep understanding of Arab and Persian and Islamic culture. This was a colossal failure. on October 7th. But I do think, and this is the thesis now I'm beginning to develop in my new book, I think that some of the cultural facets, mainly the pro-activist approach, the jointness between organizations, and the close integration between intelligence and decision-making and operations. By the way, this has both two facets. Intelligence is very much integrated in decision-making, political, strategic, military, but military commanders and decision-makers are very much reliant on intelligence.
Right.
And I think what we saw in the rather astonishing successes at the operational level, operation tactical level, in Iran, show that, again, even if you think of the public statements of Israeli intelligence officials, for example, the director of IDI and some of the young officers, they explicitly mentioned their preventive approach. They did not think of the Iranian nuclear project as an intellectual challenge. They saw themselves as having to contribute to the action intended to prevent Iran from acquiring or developing nuclear weapons. The integration of intelligence and decision-making and intelligence and operations, I think, state of the art. The issue of being proactive and the issue of integration between intelligence. Look at the rather high integration between IDI and Mossad regarding all these operations in Iran. And of course, I have to remind you that unlike the US, in Israel, there is no national entity organizing, orchestrating, and managing the intelligence community. No one.
Right.
There is no DNI in Israel. It's all informal. Informality has its weaknesses, but also has its strengths. But I do want to say, Michael, that I hear some people say, look, October 7th is a failure of strategic intelligence, and the campaign against Iran is a success only of tactical intelligence. I slightly disagree with both sides of this equation, because it's true that October 7th was a failure of strategic early warning, but it was also a failure of military intelligence, of military analysis. Israeli intelligence failed to analyze Hamas military capabilities, Hamas operational plans. So this was a larger failure. And on the other hand, I think that the campaign against Iran is not just phenomenal targeting intelligence and phenomenal operations. It's also, I think, a phenomenal success of operational level intelligence, with Israeli intelligence being able to create a list, really to conduct a systemic analysis of the Iranian nuclear program, sites, scientists, facilities, uranium, whatever, the Iranian ballistic program, missiles, launchers, sites, the Iranian military leadership. This is, I think, much more than targeting intelligence. This is operational level intelligence. Again, strategic intelligence, when I see the authentic Israeli strategic intelligence assessments, I can talk about them. So this is what I think, and yes, it is the same intelligence organization, true, with a different IDI director, but many people are still the same, with the same Mossad director. And it's the same intelligence system, I think, which failed and recovered. So strategic surprise and resilience. And I think both these issues have cultural factors, but let me come back to your initial issue. Yes, these two cases have rounded my perception of Israeli intelligence culture. It's not only that the culture is changing, I am also changing my perception of it.
Thanks for that. I enjoyed that explanation. I got one more question, and then let's go to some of our viewers. One thing you mentioned about subcultures, and we know, I think people who have had experience in the U.S. intelligence community understand what you mean by the different subcultures in the intelligence community. There's a difference in how of the cultural or organizational culture of, say, FBI and that of CIA, and that of analysts at CIA versus operational officers at CIA, et cetera. What do you think? How can you describe it? How do you describe it in these terms with military intelligence in Israel and Shabak and Mossad? How are they different in culture? Would you perceive it?
Yes, I think, first of all, the three different organizations, IDI, Shabak, and Mossad, are very different in their cultures. One of my interviewees gave me Israeli metaphors for each organization. Let me try to translate these metaphors from Hebrew to English. He told me Shabak, you know, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counter. He told me Shabak is like an emergency room. You know, you have no time. You have to conduct
Triage.
quick operations.
Yeah.
Emergency, constantly on emergency. By the way, this was a very former interviewee, which requested anonymity, but he was a very former senior official. And I told him, what about Mossad? He told me Mossad is like a plastic surgery clinic. You set a specific date and a specific time for a very specific. By the way, all these metaphors, of course, are oversimplistic, naturally, but I think they're amazing. So Mossad is very, you know, accurate, but it's very pinpoint. And then I asked him, okay, what about the IDI, which has collection and analysis and special operations, strategic, tactical intelligence? And he told me, again, this is in Hebrew, but it's something like, maybe in the US, something like, he told me, it's like Costco. I told him, what do you mean? He told me, you have everything over there, and you can never understand where are you really going? What are you really looking for? Again, he mentioned another, a retail company, a very known one in Israel. So I think that these three organizations have very different cultures, but I think, Michael, at least prior to October 7th, and then let me speak a little bit about Iran. Prior to October 7th, what I recognized, and it still went on a bit after October 7th, 2023, what I recognized is a tension and a competition for dominance between two other subcultures. Again, it's never explicit. It's always implicit. One subculture, I would call it the subculture of collection and operations. This subculture is very accurate, is very precise. It relies on technology. It is very disciplined. It is very structured. It relies on words like cooperation, coordination, jointness. It's an innovative subculture. It constantly innovates. By the way, it looks to the traditional folks and say, yeah, these are, you know, dinosaurs from the 20th century. Yeah. The other subculture is the more traditional one, the analytical one. Not just at the strategic level. The analytical subculture is very different. It's much more ambiguous. By the way, this is where I was in culture. It's an ambiguous subculture. It's a bit chaotic. It despises the words of consensus. It never looks for jointness. On the contrary, it looks for disagreements. It looks for pluralism. It's constantly under alert. Again, I don't want to get too much into psychology, but analysts in Israel, they are raised, this is how I was raised, to be constantly under alert and pessimistic, as if at any moment the adversary could surprise us. I think prior to October 7th, the collection and operations subculture, which is naturally very much embedded in military operations, has become more dominant than the analytical one. And I can tell you in some of the new interviews I've been doing for my next book, you can hear military commanding officers when I asked some of them about the early warning in October 7th. They waited for early warning information. They didn't say they waited for early warning to come from analysis. They waited for information because the information was amazing. And now if we speak about Iran, I think I have a sense that now in Israeli intelligence, not just between organizations, but also between these subcultures, the situation is a bit more balanced. But what I think has still remained very dominant, and even you can see that in the interviews with the Israeli intelligence high-ranking officers, but also junior officers, is that Israeli intelligence, and this is one of the themes of my book, perceives itself as a tool for solving problems, not just understanding them.
Right.
When people used to make fun of analysts, they say they just admire the problem. Yeah, they just admire the problem. We solve them. It has its costs, and I think it had a cost in October 7th. But now with Iran, I think the mindset of Israeli intelligence analysts was not just to inform decision makers about Fordow and about Natanz and about the Iranian ballistic missiles, was to solve this problem, which we Israelis see as existential. And I think that in terms of change of strategic culture, but specifically of intelligence culture, the two main factors for change, which I'm studying, and it's a hard study, the two main factors, first of all, is a competition for dominance between subculture, and the other one, which I think you in the US, of course, felt this after 9/11, but also after Iraq, is the influence of shock and trauma.
Mhm.
The influence of
Right.
shock and trauma makes people or understand that they have to change culture. Now, changing culture is not like changing clothes. It's different. But yes, cultures change. And I think this is a fascinating issue, not just subcultures of organizations, but also disciplinary subcultures, which is very dominant, uh, at least in Israeli intelligence.
And by the way, this was a theme that we spoke about last time you were on 3 years ago, was politicization and how that concept isn't really recognized like we recognize it in the US. I mean, by the way, if you consider your role as essentially as an executor of policy, then how can you really talk about politicization? Is
I
that
think,
an
Michael,
overstatement?
I think that first of all, I think Israel intelligence perceives itself as both informing and executing.
Right.
But I think that uh, um, politicization, and Professor Uri Bar Yosef, again, another one of my mentors, wrote many years ago that relatively speaking, compared to the US and also to the UK, the issue of politicization of intelligence in Israel from both ends, from politicians pressuring intelligence or from intelligence providing intelligence to please, was rather minor. Unfortunately, I think in the last few months, there is a trend of politicization of security and intelligence matters in Israel. Discussions about intelligence are becoming politicized. This has to do mainly, I think, with Shabak, in terms of domestic intelligence, less with Mossad, operations against Iran. Everyone is for operations against Iran. And the public discussion in Israel, and the Israeli public debate is not always very developed, but the discussion has become politicized. And the intelligence community and the security establishments are blamed for the October 7th. And you can see many Israeli politicians practically saying October 7th was a defense and intelligence failure. The successes since were mostly those of policy and strategy. Once again, my opinion, I disagree a little bit with both ends. I think October 7th was also a policy failure. And I think the successes are also military, although, of course, also strategic. And my pessimistic assessment in this case is that politicization is becoming more and more dominant in Israel. I hope not from the end of the intelligence professionals, because I think intelligence to please is the most dangerous issue. Intelligence to please, especially if you're dealing with existential threats, very dangerous.
Certainly. Okay, let's go to some of our questions now. One is, what is the role of Israel's private sector in developing an efficient intelligence culture? How does the private sector influence the intelligence culture more?
It's a great topic because I think the influence of the private sector, many Israeli people who who retire from the IDF, from the IDI unit 8200, the SIGINT unit and the special operations, but also from Mossad. Not surprisingly, many of them, I'm not sure all of them succeed, but many of them go to the high-tech industry. And I think, first of all, the private sector contributes, very much, to the issue of technology. But what I think it has contributed to, and I saw that when I was in active service, and I saw that with the interviews, for some reason, and I think this has to do, Michael, a little bit with this, my hypothesis about the collection, operation, and innovative subculture. In Israeli intelligence, many systems have become to think that they should emulate private sector and high-tech mentalities, failing fast, doing MVPs, even some, so I won't say marketing, but a mindset of innovation sometimes for the sake of innovation. By the way, One of my interviewees for my last book told me sometimes we Israelis innovate because we need to innovate, not because there's a real need. So I think this mentality, by the way, just an anecdote, there's a project which the IDI has developed about a decade ago. It was all published. It's called Tracebook. Tracebook, influenced naturally by Facebook. It's a new platform. I think probably US analysts would be shocked or probably were shocked when they saw this. It's a Facebook-like platform enabling collectors and analysts to conduct, discussions over raw information. So collectors are not really collectors, and analysts have access to raw information. And this was inspired by Facebook, by the way. Although it's a system for collectors and for analysts, it emanated from collectors, from Unit 8200. So I think what the private sector did is really provide inspiration for this mentality. There are many, many benefits for this. My personal opinion, that there are also costs, mainly the overconfidence. It's not over-reliance. Again, I have to go back to Oedipus the king of, Greek mythology and Hebrews. I think prior to October 7th, Israeli intelligence really thought that with advanced technologies and amazing surveillance technologies, some of them brought from the private sector, they could not really understand what's going in Gaza Strip. They could shape it, just like Oedipus thought that he could change his fate. And it seems to me, again, I hope I'm not being too optimistic, that some of this hubris has declined, but I think the issue of private sector influence is very important. And Israelis we like to tell ourselves that we are the startup nation. And so I think this was the influence. This was a model to envy, the high-tech model. I think Israelis, in a very Israeli style, with a very typical Israeli culture, emulated high-tech and private sector mentality too fast and in a too extreme way. Again, I think this is very Israeli, over-adaptation.
Great. We've got several questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible here. One is Valeria asks, and this is an interesting question about Iran's presence abroad and with the IRGC, right? And a lot of Americans are very interested in its presence in Latin America, but also how does Israel see the IRGC's policy abroad working out? What is it for? And does it see it changing, right, in light of current circumstances?
Yes. To be very frank, I'm not sure I'm an expert enough, at least regarding, Latin America and Africa, but I do think, and we've seen some signs to this. Look, the IRGC and the Iranian establishment more broadly developed an amazing military program of missiles and UAVs and military industries, and they had their general staff. Most of this project failed with the Israeli strikes. And I think, but there is still a core of terrorism, classic terrorism. And again, I told you, this is how I was encultured. When the Iranians say they would still revenge, I believe them. Again, I believe the Iranians when they say they will revenge. So I think on the one hand, I'm sure the IRGC and the Iranian military will rebuild their industries and military infrastructures and missiles and launchers, all these issues. But I think that they might turn, although they've also failed in the last decade or so, I think they might turn more and more to classical terrorism, which of course will be deniable on their side. Because I think that for the Iranians and for this Iranian culture and Persian culture and IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, I think they still think that they have to guard the revolution. They have not given up the Islamic revolution. And definitely they have not given up the need to guard that revolution. So I think the IRGC and maybe Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and maybe other organizations will try to conduct a terrorist attack, including, again, my pessimistic assessment, including, very large-scale terrorist attacks. to show not just the Israelis and not just the Americans, but also to show the Iranians themselves that the revolution is alive and kicking. So, and again, there are some components of the Middle Eastern project, which we Israelis have discussed so much in recent years, the Iranian entrenchment in the Middle East, many portions or many components of that project have failed. But I think they will look for opportunities in Latin America, in Europe, against Israelis, against Americans, which they've already tried to do that. And I think they have not given up that component, although in recent years they've put much more emphasis on the military component. But again, I must be frank, unfortunately, my scope about the Iranians is still a bit limited.
Another question we have is the relationship between the political leadership and the intelligence services. So in the United States, President Trump has been willing to publicly criticize the intelligence agencies for some of their assessments. Have we seen that from Prime Minister Netanyahu as well?
Look, it's a very important topic. I want to differentiate here between Shabak, domestic intelligence and counterintelligence and counterinsurgency, and IDI and Mossad.
Right.
The clashes between Prime Minister and Shabak are obvious, out in the open. Shabak is not just blamed for the colossal October 7th failure. By the way, of course, it is to blame. It is also blamed of being part of the deep state. Yes, in Israel, as in
deep
the US.
state.
Deep state, yes.
Right.
Yes, these terms are mentioned by Israeli politicians, including the prime minister. And in that sense, I think, writ large, Michael, I think that many Israeli politicians, at least the right-wing politicians, and again, I'm not judging them, but my assessment is that they have lost faith in security establishments in terms of strategy and strategic intelligence. For example, up until about a year ago, the ones running the hostage negotiations with Hamas, through Egypt and the US and of course Qatar, were the Shabak director and Mossad director, security professionals. About a year or so, this has changed, and the one running the negotiations in the Minister of Strategic Affairs on Dermer, which is practically a confidant of the Prime Minister. And you can see from what was leaked, even regarding the decisions to operate the amazing, beeper operations against Hezbollah in September 2024, and to assassinate Nasrallah, it seems as if the political leadership was very dominant in that decision-making. So relationship between, I think writ large, Israeli, at least this political leadership, has lost confidence in at least the strategic level, not on the operational tactical levels of Israeli strategic security establishments. With Shabak, I think it's a crisis of confidence, a crisis of confidence. And as you know, Shabak is also involved in an interrogation against a prime minister's advisors, which allegedly, we still don't know, of course, allegedly cooperated or promoted Qatari interests. Qatar, of course, which funded Hamas. With the IDI and Mossad, the clashes are not out in the open, out in the open. My assessment is that Israel, with the IDI and Mossad regarding strategic intelligence about Lebanon, about Syria, about Iran, my assessment is that the current Israeli politicians have just a little bit put these security establishments more focused on operational and tactical and targeting issues, and of course operations. And the Israeli politicians have become more dominant. I'm not sure that it is not that they don't trust these agencies, Mossad and IDI, but there is some sort of lack of confidence. And I think this is a very troubling issue. What troubles me the most, of course, is what do the IDI director and Mossad director think? But I think with Shabak, the clashes are out in the open. With the IDI and Mossad, I think the clashes are there, a bit of lack of confidence. But the topics, I think, are less sensitive regarding Iran, regarding Lebanon. It's not like domestic intelligence or interrogations against prime minister's advisors. And this is a change in Israeli strategic culture. Security establishments were also always very dominant. Mossad director and Shabak director saw themselves as strategic advisors to the prime minister, not just Mossad director and Shabak director. I think now Israeli politicians have taken more on their shoulders and told the security establishments, for the time being, to focus on operations and tactics. My assessment.
Another question, yeah, from Angelo, he asked about framing culture as a context that is neither unitary nor fixed. How should analysts systematically track shifts in Israeli intelligence culture itself so that blind spots can be detected in time rather than diagnosed after the fact?
Oh, yes, the $1 million question.
Right.
First of all, I can tell you when, I was in culture by Israeli intelligence for 25, 26 years, and I had to retire from military service and do a PhD to reflect on this culture. But in Israel, by the way, it's very hard to analyze culture because unlike in the US, there are no hearings like in the US in the Senate, Congress. There are no such things in Israel. By the way, the IDI director, for example, I think is maintaining a very low profile after October 7th. His predecessor had a high profile prior to October 7th. So I think recognizing changes in culture, since my perception of strategic culture and intelligence culture, and again, I'm relying on the giants of these fields, it's a context, but it combines ideas and action. I see intelligence culture, for example, as the set of beliefs, norms, values, and habits, not just the ideas, not just the concepts. And I think tracking changes in culture, at least if you're looking at Israeli intelligence culture, first of all, you have to look at Israeli declarations. But I can tell you, again, if this was the question, I hope I'm not making a mistake. If you're a scholar trying to study Israeli intelligence culture, good luck with that, because you have to rely on interviews or observations or primary sources. Observations in Israel are out of the questions. Surveys out of the question. Interviews. But I think if you're a scholar studying Israeli intelligence culture, or US or British or Russian or Chinese, whatever, if you're in a mindset of looking for changes, you will find them. It's incremental changes. It's not that someone rises in the morning, wakes up in the morning and says, okay, now my culture has changed. At least for me as a scholar and an ex-practitioner, this was a very hard challenge. It was fun, but very hard challenge.
I want to ask here Ellen's question, which is a little complicated. Do you think the Israeli intelligence system can address the question of how military operations of against at least 4 sovereign states, I put sovereign in quotation marks, that's just me, in the Middle East, and its search for hegemony will affect Israeli security in the medium to long term? What about the interface between intelligence and diplomacy under current conditions?
I think, first of all, I think Israeli intelligence should analyze the influence. Foreign policy, again, traditionally in Israel, foreign policy was always rather inferior to security matters and to military matters. I think this has changed. It might be an idiosyncratic issue, but the level of coordination between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and US President Trump seems like, at least in the case of Iran, I'm not speaking to general, once in a lifetime. So I think definitely Israeli intelligence should be able to recognize such influences and to inform foreign policy. I just think, and Michael, we spoke about the issues of resources. I think about the IDI director, for example, a 2-star general. Probably some of the people saw the dramatic events in Syria today. So the IDI director has to dedicate resources to strategic intelligence about the Iranian rationale and what is really the Syrian regime. And are there really Arab countries in the Middle East which want to join the Abraham Accords? But still, he has to provide operational intelligence and tactical intelligence for the ground operations in Gaza and for the component operations in Lebanon and for monitoring the Iranian, enriched uranium and so forth. But I think writ large, Israeli intelligence, and it's a great question because writ large, Israeli intelligence generally speaking, in its cultural tendency, avoids general and conceptual questions, such as, the influence of sovereign states over Israeli national security and foreign policy. But I think it should. My sense is that just like prior to October 7th, Israeli intelligence is once again overstretched. Now, you might say, how come it's overstretched? Iran was beaten and Hezbollah was beaten. I think it's overstretched. The challenges have changed, but the number of theaters and geographical theaters have only increased. And recognizing change is even more difficult than just following, an existing challenge. I think Israeli intelligence, IDI, Mossad, Shabak, definitely. Shabak having to deal with domestic terrorism, but also with foiling Iranian cyber attacks. Overstretched.
Couple more questions. Kevin asked about the intelligence sharing between organizations. What is there issues with stovepiping and Israeli intelligence between the subcultures, between collectors and analysts?
Yes, Kevin, of course. I think I remember that from my military service, also from my reserve service during the war, and also from my interviewees. Writ large, no. Writ large, even there is an oversharing of information between agencies. I think, I cannot discuss details, but I remember when I spoke to Americans, some of them were shocked by the level of sharing between IDI and Shabak and Mossad of raw information, not just of, strategic assessment about the nature of the Middle East or the phenomena of war. Raw information. So I think Israeli intelligence has many pitfalls and many problems and many difficulties. Stovepiping and or problems of sharing of information, I think, are not those. Again, although there's no one managing this project, information is shared. It's a rather small system. Many people know each other. This used to be a problem about a decade ago, but now I think almost no stovepiping, and even more than that. And with that, maybe I'll end. Now, Israeli analysts, many times, I think it's very different from the US, have access to an abundance of raw information, not just through collectors. They have direct access to raw information. And collectors sometimes produce such amazing intimate information that this information goes directly to decision makers. So, everyone has a unique access. So this problem, relatively, I think, is not a problem of Israeli intelligence. It has many other problems, but relatively speaking, not this one.
Hossein, I'm going to rephrase that question a little bit about regime change in Iran. This is probably one of our last questions here. Is there has been clear, it seemed like from some of the attacks during the 12-day war that there was a clear effort not just to eliminate the Iran nuclear weapons program, but also to affect regime change. How plausible does Israeli defense establishment see that outcome?
First of all, the Israeli Minister of Defense was interviewed about a week ago, and he said explicitly, he said, if we had Khamenei on our target, we would have eliminated him. This is what he said. Frankly, I have no idea if this was the case, but this is what he said. I think that Israeli defense establishment, if you look not at Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Katz, if you look about what Mossad director and especially the IDF Chief of General Staff, they were rather narrow. They did not discuss regime change. They discussed nuclear, ballistic missiles, the proxies. I think, again, first of all, I don't know. I think the defense establishment has probably done some thinking about this. To me, it seems that for this campaign, it has focused mainly on the triage of nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and the proxy model intended to destroy Israel. Less on regime change. Naturally, politicians, Michael, when we teach intelligence, we always say intelligence is mainly about the present and the past. Decision makers are all about the future. They constantly think about the future. Israeli decision makers, I believe, they had that idea in their mind. I think that the Israel defense establishment, this was not a high priority for them, but I'm not sure. I have to be very frank here.
Thanks. Let's well, we'll end it on this ambiguous note, I guess, because it's about at the top of the hour. Thank you very much, Itai, for your discussion with us today. Mention one more time for our viewers your book title.
Yes, the book title, I hope I'll say correctly. It's Israeli National Intelligence Culture, Problem Solving, Exceptionalism, and Pragmatism, like three overarching traits of Israeli intelligence culture, written prior to October 7th, but updated after October 7th, and hopefully next book next year. But this is Israeli intelligence culture, trying to analyze cultural facets of Israeli intelligence with some minor comparison to British and to American intelligence culture, and with a very dominant discussion of competition between subcultures.
Thanks for everybody for being here. Thank you again. We'll see you soon, Itai, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you very
See
much.
you soon. Bye now.
Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye. Thank you.